So one of the big events in 2016 was Rodrigo Duterte becoming the president of the Philippines in June 2016. Duterte has shown that he does not care much for restraint, both in terms of what he says and what he does. First, in terms of what he does, he has waged a war on drugs, to put it mildly, in the Philippines. This has been a continuation of his policy when he was mayor of Davao. Some 5,900 people have been killed by some estimates, either in police encounters or extrajudicially. And Duterte has shown no restraint or remorse for this, and we are expecting to see this continue. In terms of foreign policy as well, initially Duterte said that he's going to split up with the United States. This is a very long and enduring relationship that the Philippines has with the United States. Then he clarified that it's just going to be a separation of foreign policy. But he's also backed this up with action. He signed a $24 billion trade and investment deal with China. He said that he's going to come into the Chinese way, and that signals a shift away from the United States. So all this has implications for the US pivot to Asia, the geopolitics in the South China Sea, and between the United States and China. And it'll be interesting to see how it develops under the new Trump presidency.
Aung San Suu Kyi became the state councillor of Myanmar in April this year after last year's historic elections. So the election or the formation of the government by Ms. Suu Kyi's party was seen as a historical event, a turning point for the people of Myanmar, because the elections had brought the 60-year-long junta to an end. And it marked the beginning of a new era of democracy for Myanmar. Myanmar is facing several challenges, internal security challenges, besides the economic problems. So the major problem, one of the major such problems is the crisis that's going on in the Rakhine state, which is closer to the Bangladeshi border. And Rakhine state is home to Myanmar's over 1 million Rohingya Muslims who are not even seen as citizens in Myanmar. So a predominantly Buddhist majority Myanmar considers them as illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. So atrocities against this Rohingya people is quite often in Myanmar's recent history. And the criticism Ms. Suu Kyi faces is that she didn't stand up to the atrocities being committed by the military. She didn't even raise her voice against such violence, despite her reputation being an icon of democracy. So it is to be seen how Ms. Suu Kyi is going to tackle such problems in Myanmar, and her legacy and also the future of Myanmar will be based on the position she will be taking in the coming years.
So 2016 has been a very difficult year for Europe. There have been a series of terror attacks starting, I think, in March in Brussels. There have been attacks in France and most recently in Germany as well. These have been coordinated by several people, all lone wolf attacks. Several important points to take away from these attacks. Whenever ISIS, for example, has been on the back foot in West Asia, you find that around that time, generally, the number of attacks go up. ISIS has actively encouraged lone wolf attacks, providing strategy and providing a philosophical home in its extremist ideology for these attacks. The rise of the far right in Europe, that has capitalized on the fears generated by these attacks, and people have started viewing the refugees who have been moving to Europe from Asia and North Africa with suspicion, because unfortunately some of these terrorists had made their way into Europe along with refugees. There are going to be implications for elections in Europe, a number of which are around the corner, such as in the Netherlands, in France, and in Germany.
Dilma Rousseff, Brazil's first woman president, was impeached in September this year. Critics of Dilma made it as a crusade against corruption, which is a big major problem in Brazil. So there were protests across the country before Dilma's impeachment and call for her resignation, etc. Dilma personally didn't face any corruption allegation. The charges leveled against her is that she fudged the numbers, the deficit numbers in 2009. But the larger context is that Dilma became increasingly unpopular in her second term. The economy was in a shambles on the one side, and the Petrobras corruption scandal had implicated many of Brazil's political elite, including leaders of the ruling Workers' Party. The public anger was clearly building up against the establishment, and it was also against the president, whose performance was not very rosy. So the opposition who couldn't win political power, secure political power through election for the last 13-14 years, the opposition found it an opportunity and used this allegation against fudging books, against the deficit. They used it against Dilma to build a counter movement, which finally led to her impeachment. But the real problem is that Brazil's political elite is equally other. Dilma's critics are equally, including the current president, who was Dilma's vice president, Michel Temer. He is equally unpopular. And most of the members in the Brazilian Senate who impeached Dilma also face serious corruption allegations. Dilma Rousseff's impeachment doesn't actually solve any of the problems which Brazil faces. If Michel Temer fails to turn around the country's economy and restore the people's confidence in the system, he is also going to face a turbulent time ahead. The year 2016 also saw the Colombian government reaching a peace agreement with the FARC rebels. But the deal was eventually rejected by the public in a referendum. But still, both sides, both President Juan Santos and on the other side the FARC leader Timoshenko, both have said that they would stay committed towards finding a solution. They would negotiate a better deal and come back to the people, which is sort of a welcome development. But the larger implication is that why the Colombian government and the rebels have come together. There is a realistic understanding on both sides that this war is not winnable, because they were fighting a bloody war for the last 50 years. And the Colombian rebels have come to a realization that it's not possible to topple this government militarily. A government that has enormous resources, and a government that is supported by all the big powers like the United States and all. So it's practically not possible to topple this government. The government's war against the rebels have often turned counterproductive. It has ended up killing a number of civilians in the rebel-held areas, and also it has unleashed several paramilitary forces that are now posing a new security threat to the Colombian state government. If you want to bring an order, it's better to have an understanding, a political deal with the rebels. So there is actually a convergence of interest in this case. Both the rebels and the government realize that the way forward is to find a political solution because there is no military solution available to the civil war which Colombia is facing. Now the option they have is to renegotiate the deal and come up with better terms and present it to the public again, and then get the public approval so that the peace deal would eventually come into force, so that FARC could join the political and social mainstream, and that could even boost the Colombian economy according to the government's own estimates.
2016 also saw the coming to fruition of Obama's foreign policy doctrine, which has fundamentally been one of multilateralism and diplomacy. For example, the détente with Cuba, which actually began 2 years ago. Obama visited Havana earlier this year, and right now the Cubans and Americans are working on accords and trying to progress them as much as possible before Trump assumes office next month. A second act of symbolism would perhaps be Obama's visit to Hiroshima, one of the sites of the nuclear bomb, in I think it was May this year, and Monday's visit of Shinzo Abe to Pearl Harbor, which is actually not the first visit of a Japanese Prime Minister, but nonetheless very significant because it was with Obama. A third important event this year was the Paris climate deal, of course, which is one of Obama's crowning achievements. So Obama's largely, as I said, followed a policy of multilateralism and diplomacy. in terms of his foreign policy. Trump, on the other hand, has said that he will put America first. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this ripples out into the foreign policy sphere, and there will be implications for the Paris climate deal, for Cuba, as well as for Japan.
In the last days of 2016 December, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad clinched his greatest victory in this almost 6-year-long civil war. So he took the entire Aleppo, which was the largest city in Syria before the civil war broke out in 2011. It's now the government is controlling almost all of the major population centers and big cities in Syria. But the battle for Aleppo has, or it can have, larger implications for Middle East and even for the international order. Last year in 2015, Syria became the first country outside the Soviet region where the Russians made a military intervention since 1991. And through its consistent engagement in Syria and the use of force, they could capture the city of Aleppo. They could decisively shift the balance of power in the Syrian civil war. It shows that the Russians are ready to use force on the one side, and they are still able, they manage to produce results in the battleground. Is Russia planning to make a huge comeback in the Middle East that is reminiscent of the Cold War days, where the Soviet Union was a force through its allies? So are they planning to build a counterforce, a counter-alliance towards the existing the architecture of the Middle Eastern system, which is dominated by the United States and its allies? That's what we will have to look for in 2017. 2016 was one of the most tumultuous years in the history of modern Turkey. On the one side, Turkey faced several bomb explosions. Istanbul, Ataturk airport was attacked, several other places came under attack. And on the other side, Turkey is fighting a bloody civil war with the Kurdish militants in the southeastern cities. Turkey also faced a failed coup in July. Turkey faced several coups in the past, but this one was different because the president asked the people to defend the government, and this actually happened. The coup failed. But it's not clear who was actually behind the coup. The government is saying that it is orchestrated by the US-based cleric who was Erdogan's former friend turned enemy, who is now based in Pennsylvania, a cleric called Fethullah Gulen. There are two major changes that has happened in Turkey after the coup. One is that it's made Erdogan ever more powerful domestically, and the coup happened at a time when he was trying to consolidate more power for himself. He has purged his enemies in the police force, in the army, even in the civil society institutions. On the other side, Turkey is altering its foreign policy orientation. So towards the end of 2016, you could see Turkey taking decisions independent of the United States and NATO. We could see that in Aleppo, where Erdogan negotiated directly with the Russians to find a solution to take the rebels and the families out of eastern Aleppo, and also in the Moscow conference, where he sent his foreign minister to Moscow to negotiate a possible solution to the Syrian civil war with Russian and Iranian foreign ministers. Whatever happened to Turkey in 2016 could have a wider implication not only for Turkey's domestic policy but also for the larger regional policy.
So one of the tectonic shifts that happened in 2016 was the June 23rd referendum in the United Kingdom. I don't think people were expecting Britain to vote to leave the European Union, but that's what they decided to do. The reason this is huge is because for the last 40 years or so, Britain has been integrating further into the European Union, and the vote to leave means that there are going to be huge legal and economic changes. So there are millions of people, Britons living in the continent, in the European Union, and millions of European Union citizens living in the United Kingdom. So this is going to to have very real implications for their lives. It's not just about where you live and where you work that will be affected if you live in any of those countries. It's down to small everyday aspects of life, such as your pension or your health care. All these are going to have to be decided. So what to expect in terms of Brexit, the actual negotiation process, how Britain's relationship with the EU is redefined, Britain's relationship with the rest of the world in terms of trade, for example, and Britain's relationship with itself. I would say that the most significant event in 2016 was the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States last month. He's going to assume office on January 20th. And Trump is essentially a businessman, somebody with no political experience, and he campaigned often on an anti-woman, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim platform. And these are positions, the positions he adopted, they're antithetical to the United States Constitution. But despite that, he has found himself on a path to the White House. In fact, it is probably because of that many people voted for him. His anti-establishment populist rhetoric obviously resonated with enough people to win him the elections. And the United States is, by some definitions, the oldest democracy in the world, and this very peculiar outcome to its elections is likely to have repercussions around the world. I mean, we're already seeing that in Europe, for example, in Italy. Matteo Renzi's constitutional reform referendum was turned down. We have elections around the corner in the Netherlands, in Germany, and in France, and populist movements in those countries are likely to imbibe some of the momentum from what happened in America. At a general level, the international geopolitical climate is going to become more risky under the Trump administration. This is because there will be changes. Trump's campaign positions were at odds with a lot of the Obama legacy, and also by nature, Trump is more unpredictable. So how these changes pan out, well, we'll just have to wait and see.